We are going to that new beach resort.
Oh, wow. That sounds like a total blast.
What are you studying?
I'm studying accounting for my final year.
You made a mistake here. Let me correct it.
I have finally been given the job. At the firm.
She cleaned offices at night while studying accounting during the day. For 4 years, I mopped the floors of executives who did not know my name. And on the night everything finally changed, it was not because I finally proved myself to them. It was because one man caught me hiding a textbook under my cleaning cart at 11 o'clock at night and asked me a question nobody in that building had bothered to ask me in 3.5 years. What are you studying? Before I tell you what happened after he asked me that question, before I tell you about the woman who tried to make sure I never got the chance to answer it again, and before I tell you what it felt like the day I finally sat at a desk in that same building wearing my own name badge instead of a cleaner's uniform, let me say this. If anyone has ever looked straight through you like you are furniture instead of a person, stay with me till the end, because this story is proof that the people who see you when nobody else will can change the entire shape of your life. And if this is your first time here, subscribe now, because I promise you, what happened to me in that building is not the story you are expecting. My name is Ronke, and I was 23 years old when I started cleaning offices at Adeyemi Okore and Partners, a mid-sized accounting and audit firm on the 14th floor of a glass building in Victoria Island, the kind of building where the air conditioning is so cold at night that you learn to wear a sweater under your cleaning smoke, no matter how warm the Lagos afternoon had been. I had gained admission to study accounting at the University of Lagos 2 years earlier, but admission and the ability to actually pay for it were two very different things in my family. My father had passed when I was 16, a sudden illness that took him within 3 months of his first complaint of chest pains, leaving my mother with 3 children and a small tailoring business that had, until then, only ever been meant to supplement his income as a mechanic, never to carry an entire household on its own. I remember watching my mother in those first difficult months after his burial, sitting late into the night bent over her sewing machine by the light of a rechargeable lamp during the frequent power cuts, taking on every commission she could find, altering wedding dresses and school uniforms and church outfits with a determination that I did not fully appreciate until years later when I found myself pushing through my own exhaustion the same way. She never once suggested that my siblings or I should abandon our education to support the household, though I know now, looking back, how easily she could have made that argument and how much it would have cost her pride not to. My mother, a seamstress with steady hands but an unsteady income, had done everything she could to keep my 2 younger siblings, Bukola and Tayo, in school, which left almost nothing over for a university education that the government scholarship only partially covered. I remember standing in our small parlor the week before my first semester was supposed to begin, doing arithmetic in my head that never balanced, no matter how many times I recalculated it. Tuition against transport, against textbooks, against the small daily costs of simply existing on a campus far from home, until my mother finally said the words I did not want to hear but knew were coming, that if I wanted this degree badly enough, I would have to find a way to fund the rest myself. She said it gently, not as a rejection, but as a fact we both had to accept together. And I remember the particular ache of watching her say it, knowing how much she wished she could simply hand me the answer instead. I found the cleaning job through a cousin who worked in facilities management for the building, a night shift that ran from 8 in the evening until 4 in the morning, 5 nights a week, cleaning 3 floors of a firm whose partners earned in a single month more than my mother made in an entire year. I chose that schedule deliberately, painfully, because it meant I could attend morning lectures at the university after only a few hours of sleep, survive the afternoon on borrowed energy and roadside akara, and then report to work again by evening, mopping floors and emptying bins in offices belonging to men and women who would never once in those early months learn my name. I want you to understand what that schedule actually cost me, because it is easy to say she worked hard and move quickly past what those words really mean. For 4 years, I averaged 4 hours of sleep a night, sometimes less during exam periods. I fell asleep more than once on the back of the danfo home from campus, waking with a start at my stop, heart pounding, terrified I had missed it entirely. I missed my best friend's wedding because it fell on a night I could not risk losing a shift I desperately needed. I watched my course mates go out for drinks after difficult exams when I changed into my work uniform in a toilet stall on campus so I would not be late for my train to Victoria Island. There were nights I cleaned toilets with tears running silently down my face, not because the work itself shamed me. My mother raised me to believe no honest work is beneath anyone. But the exhaustion had a way of stripping away every ounce of resolve I had built up during the day, leaving only the raw, frightening question of whether I could actually sustain this pace for 4 more years without breaking. My typical day, if I can even call it typical, given how relentlessly it repeated itself with almost no variation for nearly 4 years, began around 6 in the morning, when I would wake in the small room I shared with my sister, wash quickly with water we had stored the night before because the taps in our compound ran unpredictably, and leave the house by 6:30 to catch the first of 2 buses that carried me to campus. Lectures ran until early afternoon most days, after which I would find a quiet corner of the library or an empty classroom to review whatever we had covered, because I knew I would have no real energy left for serious studying once my evening shift began. Around 5:30, I would head to a small buka near campus for a plate of rice or beans, whatever I could afford that week, then board another bus towards Victoria Island, arriving with just enough time to change into my cleaning smock in the staff restroom before clocking in at 8 o'clock. The work itself was physically demanding in ways people who have never done it rarely appreciate. 3 full floors to clean each night. Offices and corridors and conference rooms and bathrooms, heavy waste bins to carry down to the compactor, floors to mop and buff, glass partitions to wipe free of every fingerprint left behind by a day of meetings. By the time my shift ended at 4 in the morning, my body ached in a way that no amount of youth could fully protect me from, and the 2 hours of sleep I usually managed before my alarm dragged me up for another day of lectures felt most mornings like nowhere near enough. I remember a particular season during my 3rd year that I developed a persistent cough that would not fully clear, and my mother, worried, insisted I see a doctor, who told me plainly that my body was simply exhausted beyond what it could sustainably recover from night after night. Advice I heard, appreciated, and was entirely unable to follow because there was no version of that season where rest was actually available to me. If you have ever pushed yourself past what felt sustainable because giving up was simply not an option available to you, subscribe now, because the next part of this story is where a small, ordinary act of kindness began to change everything, though it would take much longer than you might expect for that kindness to fully bear fruit, and there was someone standing in the way of it the entire time I did not even know existed yet. For the first 3.5 years I worked at that firm, I was, for all practical purposes, invisible to almost everyone who worked there during the day. The partners and senior staff left before I arrived most evenings, and by the time the earliest of them returned in the morning, I had already gone home to prepare for my own lectures. I existed in the gap between their working hours, a shadow shift, present in their offices constantly and yet almost never seen by the people who actually occupied those offices during daylight. I got to know the building intimately in a way none of them ever would. which associate kept a hidden stash of biscuits in their bottom drawer, which partner's office always smelled faintly of expensive cologne no matter how thoroughly I cleaned it, whose desk was permanently buried under case files regardless of how many times I straightened them. I knew their habits the way you know the habits of people you observe closely without their awareness, and yet not one of them in 3.5 years knew not one true thing about me. I remember in my second year at the firm, overhearing 2 associates discussing weekend plans in the corridor while I emptied a nearby bin, standing close enough that I could have joined the conversation had either of them acknowledged my presence at all. And instead, I simply became part of the furniture they spoke around, the way people speak around a chair or a filing cabinet. It was not cruelty exactly, or at least not intentional cruelty. I came to understand over time that most of them had simply never been taught to notice cleaning staff as full people with names and histories and ambitions of their own, the same way most of us walk past hundreds of strangers each day without truly seeing any of them. But understanding the reason behind it did not make the daily experience of that invisibility any less isolating, especially on the night when exhaustion made it most aware of exactly how much of myself I was pouring into an existence nobody around me seemed to register. There was one exception in those early years, a young associate named Bimpe who occasionally worked late enough to overlap with the start of my shift and who was, unlike most of her colleagues, unfailingly polite, always greeting me by the name on my badge, occasionally leaving a plate of food from a client meeting on my cart if there were leftovers rather than letting it be thrown away. Bimpe never became anything close to a mentor. She left the firm for an opportunity abroad during my second year. Decency meant to me during a period when almost nobody else in that building extended it. A reminder that basic human kindness costs the giver almost nothing and can mean to the person receiving it far more than they will ever fully know. I used my break each night, a 30-minute window around midnight, when the cleaning supervisor allowed us to sit and eat something before finishing the remaining floors, to study. I would find an empty corner of whichever break room was available, spread my accounting textbooks across a small table meant for tea and biscuits, and push through problem sets on cost accounting or auditing standards with the particular exhausted focus of someone who knows this 30 minutes might be the only uninterrupted study time she gets that entire day. I got very good over those years at hiding my books quickly whenever anyone unexpected walked past, tucking them beneath my cleaning cart or inside my work bag, because I had learned early on, through an uncomfortable encounter with one of the security guards, that some people in that building did not appreciate a cleaner appearing to have ambitions beyond her uniform. That guard's name was Mr. Danladi, and though he was not unkind exactly, he had a way of looking at my textbooks the first time he noticed them that made something in my stomach tighten with an old, familiar shame. The shame of appearing to want more than your assigned place in a hierarchy allows. He asked me, not entirely gently, whether I thought studying on company time would help me clean the floors any better, and though I explained I only did it during my legitimate break, he made a small dismissive sound and told me to face my work going forward. I did not stop studying during my breaks after that conversation. I simply became more careful about where and how I did it, which is how I ended up on the particular night that changed everything, tucked into the darkest corner of the break room on the 14th floor, certain that everyone with any authority in that building had long since gone home. I was wrong about that, and subscribe now if you want to know exactly how wrong, because the man who found me that night was not supposed to be there at all, and what he did next set in motion 4 years of quiet mentorship that someone else in that building would try very hard later on to make sure never came to fruition. His name was Segun, one of the founding partners of the firm, a man whose office I had cleaned nearly every night for 3.5 years without ever once meeting him properly, because he was, by reputation among the cleaning staff, one of the busiest and most rarely seen partners in the building, a man who traveled constantly for client engagements and audit sign-offs across 3 countries. That particular night, he had returned unexpectedly late from the airport, coming straight to the office instead of home to retrieve a set of files he needed for an early morning meeting. And he walked into the break room at nearly 11:30, exhausted from travel, looking for nothing more than a cup of coffee, and found a cleaner in a company smock hunched over a textbook titled Principles of Cost and Management Accounting, working through a problem set with a pencil worn down almost to the eraser. I remember the specific panic of that moment, the reflexive urge to slam the book shut and apologize, to make myself smaller, to disappear back into the invisibility I had spent 3.5 years perfecting. But before I could gather the book into my bag, he had already crossed the room and was looking with what I can only describe as genuine curiosity rather than suspicion, directly at the open page. He asked me, in a tone I did not expect from a partner catching a cleaner apparently loitering on company time, "What are you studying?" I told him, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be, that I was in my final year of an accounting degree at the University of Lagos, working nights to fund it. I watched something shift in his expression, not pity, which I had braced for and which I have always found harder to accept than almost any other reaction, but something closer to recognition, as though he had reminded him of someone or something from long before that night. He asked to see the problem I was working on, and when I hesitantly showed him, he pointed out kindly but precisely an error in my calculation of absorbed overhead and walked me through the correction with the patient clarity of someone who had clearly explained that exact concept to junior staff many times before. He pulled a chair from the neighboring table without asking permission, the way people with genuine authority sometimes forget to ask permission for small things, and sat across from me, still in his travel clothes, his suitcase abandoned near the door, and for a moment I forgot entirely that I was supposed to be finishing the remaining 2 floors before my shift ended. He stayed for nearly 20 minutes that night, well past the coffee he had originally come for, asking me questions about my coursework, my ambitions, my circumstances, in a way that felt less like an interrogation and more like the first real conversation anyone in that building had ever had with me. He asked about my father, and I told him briefly what had happened, and he nodded slowly, the way people nod when a story confirms something they had already suspected about a person's resilience. He asked what I hoped to do once I qualified, and I admitted, a little embarrassed, that I had never quite let myself imagine that far ahead, that surviving each individual semester had taken up so much of my attention that the shape of an actual career still felt like a luxury I had not earned the right to picture clearly. Before he left, he told me something I have never forgotten, that he himself had grown up the son of a night shift factory security guard in Ibadan, that his own path into accounting depended entirely on a single teacher who refused to let his circumstances define what he was capable of, and that he intended, starting that night, to do the same for me if I was willing to let him. He told me his own father had worked nights for almost 20 years and that he remembered as a boy bringing his father's dinner to the factory gate some evenings, watching grown men in uniforms move quietly through work that most of the world never noticed or thanked them for, and that something about seeing me hunched over that textbook struck him with a familiarity he had not expected to feel in his own office building, so many years and so much success removed from that factory gate. I did not fully believe that first night that his offer was as sincere as it sounded, because I had learned through years of quiet disappointments to be cautious about promises made in a single emotional moment that might not survive contact with the next morning's busy schedule. But Segun proved over the following weeks that his interest had not been a passing sentiment, finding me during my break the following Tuesday, then the Tuesday after that, until it became, without either of us formally announcing it, a standing weekly arrangement. If that sounds like the beginning of a simple, uncomplicated success story, stay with me because it is not, and subscribe now if you want to understand exactly why, because the middle of this story is where things became far more difficult than either Segun or I expected, and the person who made it difficult was not who either of us would have guessed. Segun began meeting me quietly once a week, always after hours, always careful about the optics of a senior partner spending time with a member of the cleaning staff in a firm where hierarchy was taken seriously enough that such attention could easily be misread by others. He reviewed my coursework, connected me with study materials I could never have afforded on my own, and eventually, once he understood how close I was to completing my degree, began to prepare me quietly for the professional accounting exams that would qualify me to actually practice, a process that requires not just academic knowledge, but crucially, articling experience at a recognized firm, exactly the kind of opportunity that almost never opens itself to someone in my position without a sponsor willing to advocate strongly on her behalf. He was careful in those early months not to make our arrangement feel like charity, always framing his help in terms of my own effort and ability, rather than his generosity, correcting my work with the same rigor he would have applied to any junior colleague, rather than softening his standards out of misplaced sympathy. I appreciated that more than I think he ever fully realized, because it meant that whatever I eventually achieved, I could actually claim as mine, built on genuine competence rather than a favor extended out of pity. There were evenings he brought printed articles on emerging changes to financial reporting standards, evenings he quizzed me on audit procedures the way he might quiz a graduate trainee, evenings he simply asked how I was holding up under the weight of my schedule and listened without trying to immediately fix anything when the honest answer was that I was barely holding up. It was around this time, roughly a year into Segun's mentorship, that I first noticed something strange happening with the small opportunities he tried to create for me. He mentioned one evening that he had submitted my name for a junior internal audit trainee position that had opened up within the firm, a position specifically designed to bring promising candidates into articling positions, and that he was confident, given my grades and the quiet recommendation he intended to write, that I stood a genuine chance. 3 weeks passed without any word. When Segun followed up with Human Resources Department, he was told, to his visible confusion, that no application under my name had ever been received, despite me having submitted the required document myself, in person, to the front desk exactly as instructed.
I did not think much of it at the time, beyond simple disappointment, assuming paperwork had simply been misplaced in a busy office, the kind of ordinary administrative failure that happens in every large company. But then it happened again 6 months later, with a different opportunity, a scholarship fund the firm offered annually to support the final stage of professional examination fees for promising junior staff, a fund I qualified for easily according to every criterion Segun had reviewed with me personally. My application, again, was reported as never having been received, despite the receipt stub I still had, tucked carefully into the same notebook where I recorded my study hours. The third time it happened, involving a formal recommendation letter Segun had personally drafted and left with the Human Resources Coordinator to be filed alongside my examination registration, I finally began asking harder questions. And subscribe now if you want to know exactly what I discovered, because the answer, when it finally came, was far more painful than simple administrative carelessness, and it came from someone I had genuinely believed was on my side. The Human Resources Coordinator responsible for processing all 3 of those missing submissions was a woman named Mrs. Folashade Basi, a mid-level administrator who had worked for the firm for nearly 15 years and who had always been perfectly pleasant to me in our brief interactions, polite greetings in the corridor, occasional small talk about the weather while I emptied the bins near her desk. She had, in fact, once complimented me on my dedication when she noticed me arriving early for a shift with textbooks visibly tucked under my arm, a comment I had taken at the time as genuine encouragement rather than the carefully maintained mask it apparently was. I had no reason to suspect her of anything, which made the eventual discovery all the more disorienting. It was Segun himself who finally uncovered the truth, after growing frustrated enough by the pattern of lost paperwork that he asked a trusted colleague in IT, quietly, to check whether the firm's internal document management system retained any record of my submissions ever being logged, deleted, or otherwise altered. He told me later that he had almost let the second incident go without investigation, assuming, as I had, that it was simple administrative error. but that the third occurrence, involving a document he had personally handed to Mrs. Bassi and watched her file, felt too deliberate to explain away so easily. What that colleague found was that all 3 of my submissions had in fact been received and logged exactly as I claimed, time-stamped and everything, before being manually removed from the system within 24 hours of their submission, each deletion traced back to the same administrative login credentials, Mrs. Bassi's. When Segun confronted her privately in a closed-door meeting, he later described to me in careful, measured detail. She did not deny it immediately. He said she sat very still for a long moment after he laid out what the IT logs showed, her hands folded on the desk in front of her, before something in her composure finally cracked, and what she eventually admitted, haltingly, painfully, was a motive far more complicated than simple malice. She told him that her own daughter, a bright young woman named Tolu, with an accounting degree from a respectable but less prestigious university than mine, had applied for similar opportunities at the firm 2 years earlier and had been rejected without, in Mrs. Bassi's view, any real consideration, passed over in favor of candidates she believed had been chosen for their connections rather than their competence. She described, according to Segun, sitting beside her daughter the night that rejection letter arrived, watching a bright, hard-working young woman quietly fold the letter and put it away without complaint, the particular helplessness of a mother who cannot fix an unfairness she can see clearly but has no power to correct. Watching a cleaner, a woman whose daily presence in that building reminded Mrs. Bassi constantly of a hierarchy she resented on her own daughter's behalf, had apparently become for her an intolerable injustice, one she had decided quietly and repeatedly to correct in the only way available to a mid-level administrator with just enough system access to make a promising young woman's paperwork disappear. I want to be honest with you about how I felt when Segun finally told me the truth, because it was not simple relief. I felt a strange, uncomfortable sympathy alongside my anger, because I understood in a way that surprised me exactly what it felt like to watch opportunity flow towards some people and away from others for reasons that had nothing to do with merit. Mrs. Bassi had directed her frustration at the wrong target entirely. I had not taken anything from her daughter, and sabotaging me changed nothing about whatever unfairness her daughter may have genuinely faced. But I could not fully hate a woman whose pain, however badly she had chosen to act on it, came from a wound I recognized in my own bones. If you are still with me, if you have ever discovered that the obstacle in your path was not simple bad luck, but a person you never suspected, please subscribe before we reach the end, because what happened next, both to Mrs. Bassi and to me, is not the simple, satisfying justice you might expect, and I think it makes it more honest and more worth telling than a cleaner story would have been. The firm's managing partner, once informed of what Segun had uncovered, treated the matter with the seriousness it deserved. Mrs. Bassi was placed on formal disciplinary review, and though I did not push for her outright dismissal, a decision that surprised several of the senior staff who learned of it, I did ask, through Segun, that the firm consider whether her daughter's original application had genuinely been evaluated fairly, since if Mrs. Bassi's underlying grievance held any truth, addressing it properly seemed more useful to everyone involved than simply punishing the woman who expressed it so wrongly. I remember Segun looking at me carefully when I made that request, as though weighing whether I fully understood what I was asking for after everything she had put me through. And I told him honestly that I did understand, but that punishing Mrs. Bassi without ever examining whether her daughter had truly been wronged felt like solving only half a problem, leaving the same unfairness free to repeat itself against some other young woman none of us had met yet. The firm did eventually review that old file and found uncomfortably that Mrs. Bassi's daughter indeed had been a strong candidate who had lost out narrowly to someone with a personal connection to one of the partners, a piece of accountability the firm quietly corrected by reopening a position for her the following year, one she filled, from what I later heard, quite successfully. I never met Tolu myself, though Mrs. Bassi mentioned her once, months later, in a brief awkward exchange near the lift, thanking me in a roundabout way that neither of us fully named directly, the closest thing to an apology either of us seemed to be able to manage, given everything that had passed between us. Mrs. Bassi kept her job,
under close supervision and a formal warning. And though our relationship never became warm, we settled eventually into a very functional peace. Two women who had both been shaped in different ways by a system that made us compete for scraps of opportunity instead of receiving what we had actually earned. As for me, once my sabotage submissions were finally corrected in the system, and once Segun's recommendation letter was finally read by the people it was always meant to reach, the trajectory of my final year at that firm changed with a speed that still feels slightly unreal to me even now. I was accepted into the articling program I had been quietly working towards for 2 years, which meant at last giving up the night cleaning position I had held for 3.5 years, a moment that arrived with far more emotional complexity than I expected. I remember my last night mopping those floors, moving through offices I had cleaned in near total anonymity for so long, feeling a strange, tender grief for a version of myself that survived something genuinely difficult in that building, a woman I did not want to forget or feel embarrassed by, even as I finally stepped into a version of my life she had worked so hard to make possible. I gave my formal notice to the cleaning company that had employed me, and my immediate supervisor, a kind but perpetually harried woman named Iyabosi, who had overseen the night crew for as long as I had worked there, hugged me tightly when I told her, saying she had always suspected I was too clever to be pushing him up forever, a comment that made me laugh despite the tears gathering in my eyes. Mr. Danladi, the security guard who had once told me to face my work, was on duty that final night as well, and when I mentioned quietly that it was my last shift, he seemed genuinely surprised, asking what happened, and when I told him briefly about Segun's mentorship and the articling position waiting for me, something shifted in his expression that I did not fully understand until years later, a flicker of something between respect and quiet regret for words he could no longer take back. I completed my articling requirement over the following 18 months under Segun's continued mentorship, sitting for my professional qualification examinations in stages the way most candidates do, studying now with the relative luxury of a single job and actual sleep. Though the discipline those 4 exhausting years had built into me never fully left, and I suspect it never will. There were still difficult stretches during that 18 months, examinations I failed on my first attempt the way many candidates do, evenings I doubted whether the version of competence I had built while exhausted and sleep-deprived could actually hold up now that excuses about circumstance had mostly fallen away. Segun never let me linger too long in that doubt, reminding me each time, sometimes with more patience than I probably deserved, that the discipline I had shown for 4 years cleaning offices at night was proof enough of what I was capable of, and that a failed paper was simply information about what still needed strengthening, not a verdict on my worth. I remember the specific afternoon I received my results, confirming I had passed my final paper, sitting alone in my small flat, staring at the email for almost 10 full minutes before I allowed myself to believe it was real, refreshing my inbox twice more out of pure disbelief before the words on the screen finally settled into something I trusted. My hands were shaking slightly when I finally called my mother, and I remember struggling to get the words out clearly through my own tears, having to repeat myself twice before she understood what I was telling her. She cried on the phone in a way I had only heard her cry once before at my father's funeral, except this time the tears carried nothing but relief and pride, and she kept saying over and over that my father would have been so proud, words that undid whatever composure I had left entirely. The firm formally hired me as a qualified accountant 6 weeks later, and Segun himself walked me to my new desk on the 14th floor, the same floor I had mopped nearly every night for years, and introduced me to my new colleagues not as the woman who used to clean their offices, though several of them recognized me immediately and greeted me with a warmth that genuinely moved me, but simply as Ronke, the newest member of the audit team. I remember standing there in a new blazer my mother had insisted on tailoring for me herself, refusing payment, telling me it was the least she could do for a daughter who had carried this dream so far, mostly on her own back, and looking around at a room I had entered 1,000 times before with a mop bucket instead of a briefcase, feeling the strange, dizzying sensation of two entirely different versions of the same life folding into one another. Bimpe, the associate who had once been kind to me during my earliest, loneliest months at the firm, had long since moved abroad, but she messaged me when she heard the news, a warm, genuinely delighted message that reminded me how much even small, consistent kindness from years earlier can still matter to someone once their story finally comes full circle. Several of the associates who had once spoken around me in corridors as though I were invisible furniture made a visible effort in those early weeks to include me properly in conversations, some out of genuine adjustment, and some, I suspect, out of a slightly uncomfortable reckoning with how they had treated cleaning staff in general for years without much thought. I did not hold grudges against any of them specifically because I understood by then that the problem had never really been individual cruelty, so much as a system that made it easy not to look closely at people doing work considered beneath notice, and I prefer to spend my energy building something forward rather than relitigating a past none of us could undo. I keep in the top drawer of that desk the same worn accounting textbook Segun found me studying that first night, its cover held together now with tape, not because I need it professionally anymore, but because I never want to forget exactly how far that particular book and the man who noticed me reading it carried me. Some mornings, when a new junior staff member seems overwhelmed or uncertain of their place in a room full of more senior colleagues, I catch myself watching them a little more closely than I might otherwise, remembering exactly how it felt to be the person nobody thought to ask a real question, and I try, in whatever small ways I can, to be the kind of colleague who notices, the way Segun noticed me, on a night neither of us expected to matter as much as it eventually did. If there is one thing I want you to take from everything I have shared with you today, it is this: the people around you who seem invisible are very often carrying entire worlds of effort and hope that you simply have not taken the time to notice. And sometimes the smallest question, asked with genuine curiosity instead of suspicion, is enough to change the entire direction of someone's life. I think about Mr. Danladi sometimes too, the security guard who once told me to face my work instead of studying. I saw him again years later, visiting the building for an old colleague's retirement party, and when he recognized me at my desk, badge and all, he did not quite know what to say, and neither, honestly, did I, beyond a polite nod that held more history than either of us could have explained to the people around us. I think, too, about how easily the entire trajectory of my life could have gone differently if Segun's flight had not been delayed that particular evening, if he had simply gone home instead of stopping by the office for those files, if he had walked past that break room without pausing to look closely at what I was reading. I do not say this to suggest that my success depended entirely on luck, because the 4 years of exhaustion and discipline that came before that night were entirely my own, and the hard way, with no guarantee they would ever be noticed at all. But I have learned to hold both truths at once, that I worked as hard as anyone could reasonably ask of a person, and that I was also, in the end, fortunate that someone finally looked closely enough to see it. Both things can be true, and I think pretending otherwise does a disservice to everyone still working just as hard in rooms where nobody has yet thought to ask them a real question. If this story reminded you of someone who saw you when nobody else did, or someone you passed by without truly seeing yourself, I would love to hear about it, and I hope you will stay close, because I have many more stories like this one still to tell. Subscribe before you go, not because I need the number to climb, but because somewhere out there, right now, someone else is hiding a textbook under a cleaning cart, hoping someone notices, and maybe this story reaches them in time to remind them not to give up.